Before Tupac became the voice of a generation, his godmother was already America's most wanted woman. And before she died, she revealed something about Tupac's death that could change everything you think you know. Tupac's story didn't start with rap, it started with a bloodline of revolutionaries. His godmother, Assata Shakur, lived her last years in exile, but what she confessed about Pac's murder may be the key we've all ignored. She escaped prison with dynamite, lived free in Cuba, and became Tupac's godmother. But what Assata Shakur said before her death in 2025 could rewrite the story of hip-hop's biggest tragedy. Before Tupac Shakur became the voice of a generation, his godmother was already one of the most hunted women in America. Assata Shakur, who passed away in Cuba at the age of 78, spent her final years unbroken, unbowed, and free. But what she revealed about Tupac's death before she died may force us to rethink everything we thought we knew. This story isn't just about her passing. It's about bloodlines, legacy, and the kind of bond between a godmother and her godson that left an indelible mark on hip-hop. Assata Shakur, born Joan Deborah Byron on July 16, 1947, in Queens, New York, was raised in an environment where struggle wasn't optional. It was everyday life. Her parents split early, and she moved between New York and the Jim Crow South, where racism was as ordinary as the air she breathed. Money was scarce, and her search for belonging often led her to run away from home. That began to change when she moved in with her aunt, Evelyn A. Williams, a civil rights activist who guided her toward education and activism. By the mid-1960s, Joan Kezimard was no longer just another college student trying to find her way in the world. She was living in the middle of a storm. The United States was shaking under the weight of the civil rights movement. Leaders like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and groups such as the Black Panthers were lighting up the streets with both fiery speeches and organized resistance. For a young Black woman like Joanne, college was not only about books and classrooms, it was about survival, identity, and deciding which side of history she wanted to stand on. On campus, Joanne saw the limits of what higher education had to offer. The classrooms were filled with white professors teaching versions of history that erased or distorted the Black experience. The textbooks skimmed past slavery as if it were just a footnote. The contributions of Black thinkers, inventors, and leaders were either ignored or presented as side stories. Joanne, like many of her peers, knew something was deeply wrong. So when students began organizing protests to demand more Black professors and a full curriculum on Black studies, she joined without hesitation. To her, it wasn't simply about classes, it was about reclaiming history, identity, and truth. These protests were fueled by a growing sense of urgency. Young people wanted their education to reflect their reality. They wanted to hear about their ancestors, their struggles, and their triumphs. In 1967, during one of these sit-ins, Joanne was arrested for the first time. For her, it wasn't just a run-in with the police, it was a wake-up call. Sitting in that cell, she realized how far the state was willing to go to silence young Black voices. The arrest stripped away the last illusions she carried about America's justice system. The tidy version of history she had been fed in classrooms, that the US was always a land of freedom and fairness, collapsed right in front of her. She saw with her own eyes that standing up for dignity meant paying a price. This turning point pushed Joanne to go deeper. She began studying history from sources outside the classroom, Black writers, revolutionaries, and liberation movements from around the world. She discovered that the oppression Black people faced in the US wasn't isolated. It was connected to the struggles of colonized people across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. She began to see herself as part of something much bigger than just a student movement. And then came the moment that marked a rebirth. Joanne shed her birth name and took on a new one, Assata Ulugbala Shakur. It was not just a cosmetic change, not just a rejection of the name given to her by a system she no longer trusted. It was a deliberate act of self-definition. Assata meant she who struggles. Ulugbala meant the thankful one. Shakur was the name she carried into her revolutionary family. Together, the name was a declaration, almost like a contract with herself and with the world. She was announcing that her life would be a struggle, but not a pointless one. A struggle rooted in gratitude, in knowing where she came from, and in commitment to where she was going. Her new identity also reflected something deeply personal. Names carry power, and for Black people in America, whose ancestors had their names stripped away by slavery, reclaiming a name was a way of reclaiming humanity itself. For Assata, the name change was freedom in its purest form. It was her way of saying, I refuse to let this system define me. I will define myself. This was the era when the Black Panther Party was gaining momentum. Their message was bold, unapologetic, and direct. Black people have the right to defend themselves, the right to self-determination, and the right to dignity. Assata resonated with that message. She admired their discipline, their sense of community, and their fearlessness in standing up to state power. The Panthers weren't asking politely for change, they were demanding it. But it wasn't only the Panthers who shaped her. She was also drawn to the ideas of Malcolm X, who had already warned Black America that liberation would never come from the same government that built its wealth on slavery and oppression. Malcolm's insistence on global connections, his call to link the Black struggle in America with anti-colonial fights abroad, gave Assata a broader vision. Her early activism, arrests, and growing political awareness all forged her into someone who could never go back to living a quiet life. She had seen too much, learned too much, and felt too much. Assata's journey from Joan to Assata was not just about adopting a revolutionary name, it was about choosing a revolutionary destiny. By embracing her new identity, Assata was also embracing responsibility. A name like She Who Struggles doesn't leave room for comfort or complacency. It means your life will be dedicated to pushing against oppression, even when it feels impossible. It means carrying the weight of your people's suffering and transforming that pain into resistance. Her transformation also mirrored the larger transformation happening across the nation. All over America, young Black men and women were redefining themselves, reclaiming their roots, and rejecting the narrow roles society tried to force on them. They were cutting their hair into afros, calling themselves by African names, and declaring pride in being Black. Assata was part of that wave, but her path would take her further than most, into the heart of one of the most intense political battles of the 20th century. Looking back, her decision to rename herself was the beginning of the life she would later become known for, a life of resistance, exile, and legacy. The girl who entered college as Joan Kezimard emerged from those years as Assata Shakur, a woman who knew the cost of truth but was willing to pay it. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most radical act is simply claiming your own name, your own history, and your own voice, and refusing to let anyone take it away again. In 1970, she joined the Black Panther Party in New York. The Panthers weren't simply talking revolution, they were running programs that fed hungry children, opened community clinics, and educated their neighborhoods. Assata organized, taught, and served work that changed lives in Harlem and beyond. But she also saw the flaws within the movement: sexism, disorganization, and growing internal conflict. By 1971, tensions boiled over inside the Panthers, worsened by the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which spread lies and stoked divisions. Out of that chaos came the Black Liberation Army, a group determined to take the fight beyond protests and directly into the streets. Assata joined them, committed to pushing the struggle further. Around that same time, another chapter of this story was unfolding. On June 16, 1971, Afeni Shakur, a Panther who fought her own legal battles while pregnant, gave birth to a son in East Harlem, Lassane Parish Crooks, later renamed Tupac Amaru Shakur, after a famed Incan revolutionary. When Afeni later married Mutulu Shakur, Assata's brother, the bond between Assata and young Tupac was sealed. She wasn't just his godmother in name, she was part of the revolutionary family that raised him. Tupac grew up immersed in the language of struggle. His stepfather Mutulu, his mother Afeni, and his godmother Assata gave him more than love. They gave him stories of survival, sacrifice, and resistance. In his own words, Pac described himself as coming from a rich line of Panthers and revolutionaries. His art, poetry, and music carried those lessons forward. But the struggle that shaped him also came at a heavy cost. On May 2, 1973, Assata Shakur was stopped on the New Jersey Turnpike along with two members of the belay. What followed was a violent clash that left one state trooper dead, one of her comrades killed, and Assata herself critically wounded. She was later tried by an all-white jury, convicted of murder, and sentenced to life, even though the evidence showed she had no gunpowder residue on her hands and had likely been shot with her arms raised. Her eventual escape to Cuba turned her into a symbol, a freedom fighter to some, a fugitive to others. For nearly 5 decades, she lived there, untouchable by U.S. authorities, until her death in 2025. Yet, Assata's life was never just about her own fight. It was about passing on a legacy of resistance, one that flowed directly into the life of her godson, Tupac. Their connection helps explain the fire in his lyrics, the urgency in his voice, and the unshakable sense that he carried more than just his own story. He carried the weight of generations. Medical experts testified that the nerve damage in Assata Shakir's arm made it physically impossible for her to fire a weapon. Yet in 1977, an all-white jury still convicted her of first-degree murder, sentencing her to life plus decades more. In her community, that verdict felt like a modern-day lynching delivered by the legal system. Then came November 2, 1979, the night Assata Shakir's name moved from news headlines to street legend. This wasn't a movie script. This was real life. 3 armed activists linked to the Black Liberation Army and the May 19th Communist Organization entered Clinton Correctional Facility for women in New Jersey pretending to be visitors. They carried fake IDs, hidden weapons, and even a stick of dynamite. With military precision, they took 2 guards hostage, seized a prison van, and drove it straight across an open field before switching to getaway cars waiting nearby. No one was harmed. The operation had been funded with $15,000 stolen from a department store earlier that year. And just like that, Assata Shakur vanished underground, a living symbol of defiance against a system that tried and failed to contain her. For 8-year-old Tupac, his godmother's escape turned her into something more than human. She became mythic proof that the system could be outsmarted if you were brave and committed enough. But that kind of life came at a cost. Mutulu Shakur, who helped plan her escape, was arrested in 1986 and spent decades behind bars before dying in 2023. The family's commitment to revolution was paid for with their freedom and, in some cases, their lives. Assata herself hid in Pittsburgh for nearly a year, then fled to the Bahamas and eventually reached Cuba in 1984, where Fidel Castro granted her asylum. He called her a victim of political persecution, a decision that turned her into a permanent piece in the long-running chess match between the US and Cuba. Tupac was 13 when Assata settled in Havana. Because of US travel restrictions and her fugitive status, there's no record of them meeting face-to-face after she fled. But her presence was still alive in his world. His mother, Afeni, kept Assata's name and story circulating in their home. Young Tupac absorbed it all like scripture. When he began making music, it wasn't just entertainment. It was testimony. It was prophecy. On his 1991 debut album Tupacalypse Now, in the track Words of Wisdom, he shouted out Assata alongside figures like Mutulu Shakur and Geronimo Pratt. America's Nightmare, he called them not as an insult, but as a badge of honor, a declaration of lineage and values. And here's where it cuts deep. What did Assata really think of Tupac? Because of her exile, her public words about him are rare. But one interview published by the New African People's Organization after 1996 shows her feelings plainly. "I love his music," she said. "Even when I don't agree with what he's saying. He touched parts of people's guts they don't even recognize, let alone express." For a woman who gave up her country, her freedom, and her safety for her principles, that was a powerful admission. She recognized Tupac's genius and his contradictions, the push and pull between his revolutionary roots and the gangster image, between empowerment and materialism, between consciousness and violence. She compared him to earlier leaders like Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, noting that this contradictory consciousness had been a recurring struggle for Black leaders and artists alike. "The mind-destroying machine works overtime," she warned, teaching us to crave power and money instead of justice. Then came the words that haunt her supporters to this day. Reflecting on Tupac's death, she said, "He was only 25. One of the things that makes me sad is there was no strong community of African revolutionaries to protect him and help educate him. Those who loved him did all they could, but they were competing with very powerful, negative forces." Read that again. Assata wasn't just mourning Tupac, she was calling out the movement itself for failing to shield him. Her words framed his murder not just as a personal tragedy, but as a collective loss. On September 7, 1996, Tupac attended the Mike Tyson, Bruce Seldon fight in Las Vegas. After a scuffle with Orlando Anderson in the MGM Grand Lobby, he and Suge Knight left in a BMW. At 11:15 p.m., a white Cadillac pulled alongside them on East Flamingo Road. Gunfire erupted. Tupac was hit 4 times. Suge Knight was wounded by fragments, but drove them to safety. Tupac underwent 3 surgeries, including the removal of a lung, but his body couldn't recover. On September 13, 1996, at 4:03 p.m., Tupac Amaru Shakur died of respiratory failure and cardiac arrest at just 25 years old, haunting her until the end. Exile didn't silence her voice. From Cuba, Asada worked as an editor for Radio Havana, raised her daughter, earned a master's degree, and remained a revolutionary thinker. Her influence stretched far beyond politics into music and culture. She became a patron saint of conscious hip-hop. Public Enemy name-dropped her, Common dedicated an entire song to her, The Roots and Jay-Z sampled her voice. For many artists, she represented the living proof that hip-hop could be more than entertainment. It could be resistance in rhyme. Then, in September 2023, the story of Tupac's murder cracked open again. Police in Las Vegas arrested Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, charging him with orchestrating the 1996 hit. Davis had practically confessed in interviews and even in his memoir, claiming he was in the white Cadillac the night Pac was shot. But he also dropped a bombshell, alleging that Sean Diddy Combs had once offered $1 million to have both Tupac and Suge Knight killed. Diddy denied the claims as beyond ridiculous, and police insisted he was never a suspect. Still, whispers continued, with Pac's family hiring attorney Alex Spiro in 2024 to push for answers. Keefe D's trial is set for February 2026. While new chapters unfolded in courtrooms, Asada lived her last years quietly in Havana. She admitted she missed family and Black American culture, but for the first time in her life, she felt safe. In Cuba, she said, "I can walk down the street at 3 in the morning and feel at peace. I never felt that in America." She reconciled with her daughter, taught classes, wrote, and kept her fire alive, always connecting her personal journey to the bigger struggle against racism and imperialism. On September 25, 2025, Asada Shakur passed away at the age of 78. Tributes poured in from activist groups around the world. Black Lives Matter and Asada's daughters honored her as a revolutionary. Politicians in New Jersey condemned those tributes as shameful. The divide was nothing new. It had always been there, and it will remain, because Asada Shakur was never meant to be safe or comfortable. She was meant to be a challenge. And that's where her story folds back into Tupac's. Every time his song, Words of Wisdom, plays and you hear him declare, Asada Shakur, America's nightmare, it's more than a shout-out. It's a lineage, a promise, a refusal to forget. But the contrast cuts deep. Asada found peace in exile and lived to 78. Tupac died in chaos at 25, unable to escape the forces circling him. She outran the trap. He was consumed by it. Yet Asada never placed blame on him. Instead, she placed it on the system and on the failure of community to protect him. That is the lesson she wanted carried forward. Tupac's story wasn't about weakness or bad choices. It was about what happens when someone is born into a war they didn't start, surrounded by forces too powerful to fight alone. As long as imperialism exists, you will have racism, she once said. For her, Tupac's death wasn't just gang beef. It was another casualty in the same war she had spent her life fighting. Her final words about him weren't about conspiracy or cover-ups. They were about responsibility. Genius isn't enough. Talent isn't enough. Good intentions aren't enough. What's needed is community, guidance, protection, and love. That, Asada Shakur said, is the world we must build, a world where the Tupacs of the future can grow in love and never again fear that a gunshot will silence their light too soon.